Hi, my name is Raul Abdullazade, and today in my presentation, I'm going to analyze the organizational change based on this case study of iyo408 of management and organization. I'll mainly focus on the power, politics, and why the changes were not really successful. In this slide, I'm going to explain about the company. The company was about a large police organization that had serious corruption issues. Originally, it had a very hierarchical, almost military-style structure where power was concentrated at the top of the company. After a government inquiry, the organization introduced reforms like teamwork, empowerment, and a flatter structure. In this presentation, the main goal is to analyze whether these changes actually worked by doing it with the theories of power and organizational change. The main reason for a change was a government investigation that exposed that the company had widespread corruption. After a thorough investigation, it was found that all of this was linked to detectives who had gained too much power over time, and also there was a strong code of silence, which meant that employees didn't report misconduct. Because of the rigid hierarchy, lower level officers didn't really have a voice of their own to speak, and after some time, the organization lacked transparency and accountability, which made the change necessary. For example, as we can see on the slide, using Levin's model, this situation represents the unfreezing stage, where pressure forces the organization to change. Also, Shine's theory helps to explain how deep cultural norms supported these problems. Here we can see the 5 bases of power that the detectives use in order to control other people, which are legitimate, reward, coercive, expert, and referent. The main ones that detectives used in order to be dominant were the expert power, which means that they had knowledge that others depended on. The other one that was also in a main use by the detectives was a coercive power, which means that they used to do threats and intimidations towards other workers, and even if they weren't officially in charge, they still had status, so people treated them like authority figures. And also they controlled the information and the decisions, which they made them even more powerful. From the evidences of the power in the case and from the meeting, we can clearly see that detectives still remain dominant in the company. They are interrupting others, controlling the discussions, and even using the threatening language, which leads to that officers don't speak unless they're asked to speak, which shows that there is a lack of confidence and autonomy among the firm. What's really interesting is that some employers supported detectives during the meeting, even though they had complained earlier about them. This means that some of the workers, lower level workers, still see them as authority figures and are too scared to make a move. And also there is something called political behavior, which means that they are avoiding the conflict to protect themselves. In order to fix this problem, the organization introduced several structural changes such as cross-functional teams, flatter hierarchies, and also decentralized decision-making. However, in reality, these changes did not lead to any real behavioral change. They were a complete disaster. Detectives still dominated, and also the employees were still too reluctant to speak. So even though the structure changed, the culture among the firm remained the same. According to Kotter, successful change requires embedding new behaviors into the organization, which clearly did not happen here, which is why the lower level officers were still too scared to speak and too scared to say their own opinion, even though they were not supporting the detectives earlier. Here are the challenges to change for the firm that caused a lot of problems. The main challenge was the resistance, especially from the detectives who did not want to lose their power among the company. Another issue was that the organization culture, particularly the code of silence that they had, which discouraged openness. The code of silence led to the psychological safety, meaning that employees didn't feel comfortable speaking up because they were too scared of the detectives. And finally, the informal power structures remained stronger than the new formal structure, which means that there was a limited impact of the change among the company in order to make the lower level officers more comfortable. The key insights of this case is that the structural change alone is not enough. You also need a cultural change in order to resolve the problem in the company. Also, the informal power can override formal systems. In addition, we can see that even though the company redesigned the structure, the behavior and the power dynamics did not change, which means that detectives still remained dominant in the company. And the last but not the least is that the company should target not only the cultural changes, but also the structural changes in the company. To improve the situation, I would recommend the company doing a few things. The first one is that they should focus more on the culture, not just the structure. And secondly, I think that leaders need to actively challenge informal power and enforce accountability, which means that reducing the power that the detectives have over the lower level officers. Also, they need to create a psychological safety gap for the lower police officers so that the employees they feel comfortable speaking up, and because as you know from the previous slides during the meeting, the officers were too scared to speak up even though they were criticizing the detectives earlier. And finally, I recommend that in a long term the cultural change is necessary to align behavior with the organization's values. In conclusion, I want to say that even though the organization introduced significant changes, they were not fully effective because detectives still remained a high authority and they still retain their power through the informal influence, and the culture of silence remained, which means that the lower level officers and employees were still too scared to speak up on their own and carry a voice. So overall, this case shows that successful organizational change requires addressing both structure and culture. So finally, there are the main academic sources that were used in this analysis, also known as a list of references. So this was all. Thank you very much.